Good morning, everybody, and welcome to StudioLIFE. Really excited. I'm so excited about this incredible guest today, Michele Paradise, who is a trauma-informed therapist, relationship coach, a clinical hypnotherapist. She's done NLP. Today's talk is something that every single one of us can relate to, and it's about people pleasing. You've been for over 20 years working in this field. We were on a talk today and you said, I am a recovering people pleaser. And I laughed out loud. I didn't laugh out loud, but I thought I can put my hand up to that as well. So that's the area I really want to focus on, because I think all women, to greater or lesser degrees, suffer from this people pleasing. Your story is phenomenal. I know it started off with you being a model. So why don't you kick off telling us a little bit about your background, your story. You've got 30 seconds because I want to delve into this really meaty subject.
Thanks, Grace. I was born in the East Coast of the United States, and I'm very tall. When I stand up, I'm almost 6 feet tall, and I've always loved fashion, wanted to be famous. So a friend took some photos of me and said, you should be a model. And long story short, Zandra Rhodes came into town, into Washington, D.C. And concurrently with that, Terry Mugler came into town, and they both discovered me and invited me back to, respectively, London and Paris. And that began my career as a runway model, catwalk model. Because in those days, 1980, you were one or the other. You weren't both. And it was in the 90s that there was this crossover of celebrity were on the catwalk, or print models were on the catwalk. And I then modeled for 20 years for most of the top designers, and latterly met Philip Tracy, the millionaire, and became his muse. I worked for him for about 10 years, or with him, I should say. So I had a 20-year modeling career, and during that time, I was smoking a lot. And I met this makeup artist behind stage, and she said, you know, how are you doing? We're talking, and I said, well, I'd like to stop smoking because I had to keep going outside to have a cigarette. And she introduced me to someone who did hypnosis and NLP and on Harley Street. So I went along, and what was so interesting about it is I did stop smoking, but I also didn't realize I had such a fear of flying as well. I flew, but I was really uncomfortable. And that began to dissipate as well. It took a few things out, which was really great. And that piqued my interest in all of the things that you mentioned. So I asked him what he was doing. He said NLP, hypnosis. There's a training in 2 weeks with Paul McKenna and Dr. Richard Bandler, who is the co-creator of NLP.
Yeah. And
I never looked back. I did my...
So while we're on that subject, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and I actually... did some NLP for myself, and I'll talk a little bit about that and why I needed it. But it's a very, very powerful tool in the armor of life, not just midlife. So for everybody who's listening in, explain what NLP is, neuro-linguistic programming, and why is it relevant? Why is it important?
Well, I'm going to use Dr. Bandler's phrase that he said to us. It's thinking on purpose, which I loved. And I'll back up for a bit to explain why or how we don't do that. Because it's highly researched that we spend about 90 to 95% of our day in a hypnotic state, but not one that we've chosen. We know how to open a door, so we're opening doors, eating food, driving cars. We're not really thinking about it. Everything is muscle memory. And a lot of those patterns, those muscle memory patterns, are actually quite negative. Like, I'm not good enough. We have this inner critic that's talking to us.
It's that muscle memory, but also it's that the conversations we have with ourselves are almost subconscious.
Yes.
It's a pattern that we've learned, we've got, and we're just not aware. And you're absolutely right. So much of it is negative.
Most of it is negative because we are our worst critic. It's not our fault. It's patterns that we learn to survive, which is great because it's amazing what children can do without realizing what they're doing, but it's totally unconscious. By the time we're doing it, it's unconscious. And a lot of what I learned,
our survival mechanism,
Yes.
isn't it?
It's
part
absolutely
of to keep us safe.
Yeah.
That's why there's a role for fear. It's
Well,
part of our survival mechanism.
Yes, when a child is born, the first 3 years of their lives, they are pretty nonverbal. And our brain isn't fully formed till we're about 26 years old, where we can really process the emotions and all of that. And in the first 7 years of our lives, we're developing our personality. But what every child needs is three things: to be seen, to be heard, and to be accepted just the way they are, not to be changed when they're a child. So if the child is angry, I'm not saying you need to accept the anger all the time, but be with the anger. I won't go into parenting things, but just to explain where this comes from. So what a lot of us do is we, in the first 7 years of our lives, adapt our personality to get those needs met.
Yeah.
And they're not always the best adaptations. They can be the life of the party, the fixer, the people pleaser, the narcissist, the joker. There's lots of archetypes, and we can have several going on at the same time. So we got a lot of this negative chat going on. And what Dr. Bandler and NLP really taught me is how we run films. Unconsciously, we're running films, and we usually, as I say, we're usually running Hollywood disaster films and not Hollywood rom-coms. You know, it's like, oh my God, it's catastrophe everywhere. So this is what we're thinking, and we're not thinking on purpose. We're just allowing our thoughts to carry us instead of waking up.
Because I think part of it is, if it's happening in the sort of subconscious, we're not aware, are we? We're sort of, and that's part of the self-awareness, the mindfulness, and also like when we talk about the inner critic, which I talk a lot about, you have to stop and you have to consciously have that awareness to go, no, this is my critic talking, this is not me. But you have to stop it in its tracks in the first place, and that's self-awareness, which is why they talk a lot about mindfulness, don't they? It's just be present, stop, be present, come up for air, and then absorb, be aware, because you can't change anything if there's no self-awareness. So the NLP bit is being more conscious and self-aware of that rhetoric. And I've read some books where they say that sort of inner critic, if it helps, personify it, or put an image to it, or give it a name.
Absolutely. Give it a funny name so it makes you laugh every time that you think about it. But you really nailed it there. I have this process I use called the Paradise process, funny. And it's 4 steps to healing. And the first one is awareness. Without awareness, you have nothing. You can't see what you don't acknowledge. You can't change what you don't acknowledge, is what I meant. So the first one is awareness. The second is radical acceptance of self in this moment. This is who I am in this moment. I can change. You know, I have the desire to do things differently.
I think the acceptance piece is to that self-acceptance, or that acceptance is with kindness,
compassion,
absolutely. And saying it's okay to feel like this, or and I think what happens, it's almost like a go-to, is we wrap it around guilt and shame. Always. It's the shame monster.
Yes.
So
absolutely,
you will never move forward positively if you condemn yourself and that shame and that almost self-flagellation. So for me, it's being kind and empathetic, and in the same way that if you were speaking to a friend, you would be, we are so compassionate and understanding and empathetic and kind, and we put our arms around our friends. But we never do that to ourselves, do we? We're so harsh.
No.
We're terrible friends to ourselves, and we're really harsh self-critics.
You reminded me, if I may share a metaphor that I use with my clients, because we're in a room, and even if they're on Zoom, there's always a door, right? So I say, there's a knock on the door, and you go to the door and you open it, and there's a small little girl, let's say, and she's really upset, crying. What would you do? And they're like, well, I would get down to her size, and I would, if she wanted me to cuddle her or whatever, you know, very compassionate. And I said, oh, so you wouldn't shout at her and get angry with her? No. You wouldn't slam the door on her? No. And then I say, but this is what we do to ourselves
100
all the time. And they're like, yeah, I didn't think about it that way. But we get angry with ourselves for doing the same thing over and over again. It's why did I do that again? Why did I date that loser again? Or whatever the thing is. Or we shut it away and distract ourselves and go do something else.
We feel shame, or we feel guilt, but it's always a negative.
Absolutely. And you know what, Dr. Gabor Mate, who I'm training with, he said guilt is wanting to manage the outcome of someone else's expectations. And it blew me away. And and that goes into people pleasing, because we want to manage the outcome and the expectations of what we've said to that person or what we've done with that person. And we can't. We just can't do it. So then we feel guilty because everything comes back to self. If you were raised not believing you were good enough, well, of course, everything you do is going to circle back to, it's my fault.
Absolutely.
I'm not
so
good
I'm
enough.
quite interested in, and we'll come back to the NLP, but in terms of this rhetoric, I kind of feel it's much more prevalent in women. And I think we had a conversation before about, because out of that drives perfectionism, meeting expectations. So those expectations could be parental expectations, it could be social conditioning, it could be stereotypes, like the stereotype for women, and even conditioning, from a female perspective of you can have it all. Right?
Yes.
It's very hard to have it all. So all of that societal expectation, to achieve that is very difficult. And I would say actually it's unachievable. So therefore, if you have not achieved, you are not successful. And then it's a negative, 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 negative. And then wonder why so many women don't have inner confidence, real self-worth, or feel that they are successful, etc., etc. Is that more prevalent in women, would you say, rather than men? And I've worked with so many women, especially in the field of sort of, makeup, and I'm, interacting with women every single day in my life. And I'm always about building women up. So I always start with a compliment, right? And it's when you look in the mirror, it's giving yourself a compliment. And you'll say to women, your skin is amazing today, or I love what you're wearing. And what I find really interesting is every woman goes, oh yeah, but look at this, or look at my dark circles. Oh yeah, but
we're not this old thing.
But it's always a negative. It's part of that negative rhetoric. Why do we do that? Is it because there are expectations that are so unrealistic for women, and we buy into it and we put that pressure on ourselves? Or why do we do that? Because I don't see men doing it in the same way. If you give a man a compliment, he's like, yeah, thanks, I'll take that.
I wish I had a profound answer, but it is conditioning. And I don't blame parents, because I think there's something called generational trauma, legacy trauma. And within that, we're handing down what we know. We only know what we know. We're doing the best we can with the knowledge and the information we have. So I was raised, and this is no reflection on my parents because they were conditioned, but I have an older brother, and when I came up to wanting to go to university, there was a chance of a scholarship and all that. And my father wouldn't sign the papers. Now, he would for my brother. Now, I was very angry with him. I won't say that I wasn't, but then when I grew up, I began to have some understanding and compassion for what he knew.
Yeah.
And he didn't know about education, right? But my point
and also it has no value for women to have education, because it's the male that go on to pursue careers and be the provider, and we stay at home and nurture and create homes.
Absolutely.
So I get that.
Females are conditioned to please, to go along, to get along. Some of these phrases I use in my workshops. We call it the disease to please. And it is like a disease. It's like a virus that gets inside of you. And you may tell I'm American, so your followers may be able to tell that. So when I came here, I couldn't believe how many times people say, I'm sorry. So we use different phrases. We used to say, excuse me. So in my workshops, I say, I want you to ask yourself, before you say you're sorry, what are you apologizing for? And most of the time, women don't realize it, but they're apologizing for the space that they're taking up in that moment. They are, but they don't realize it because it is such a muscle memory. It is so unconscious. It is be a good girl, be a nice girl. Girls don't argue. Girls don't do this. Well, girls can cry, right?
Exactly.
Boys can't.
Yeah, and crying means you're weak and you're
Yes.
feeble, and therefore
Yes.
you need to be protected
And you need help.
and all that sort of
You need
stuff.
help.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because my mother had, she had the most incredible, beautiful values, but I grew up with be a good girl, be this, be that, and it was in life a little bit unrealistic, because you can't be a good girl, a good person, only have good thoughts. And if I ever said I hate X, she'd say you can't say hate, you can't.
That's right.
You know, you have to be appreciative, you have to be grateful, you have to be. If I had an opinion, it wasn't my place to have an opinion.
Oh,
So
no.
therefore, if I don't have an opinion, that means I don't have a voice. So if I don't have a voice, therefore I need to be quiet. When I look back on it, it was so formative. And of course now I have a voice, and I'm passionate about women being empowered and feeling empowered and confident, which is interesting, because maybe it's a throwback to my childhood, why I am now doing what I'm doing, if that makes sense.
I think it's part of your drive, your propulsion system, that because I'm very similar. My father's favorite expression was, you should be seen and not heard, because he valued the way people, women in particular, looked. He valued that they were attractive and they dressed well and they had their hair done and all of that. And I kind of have that inside of me. I rarely show up not looking my best, if possible. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that's my ritual.
I think it's a good thing.
That's my ritual.
And I think it's a good thing. I think the difference is you do it now. I do it for me.
Yes, it's my
Not
choice.
for anybody else. I do it for me because I value myself and I'm worth it, and I'm worth that time.
Exactly.
If that makes sense. And there's a nuance, isn't there? Whereas
there is a nuance to it.
And actually, talking about that, when I think about beauty, women traded on their beauty, didn't they? That their value was their value and their currency was their beauty. And I think that goes back to evolution, because if you go all the way back, it's our beauty that attracted a mate to procreate. And so I understand that dynamic, but it's very different now, if that makes sense.
It is, but however, I still see the conditioning in Gen Zs.
Yeah.
I still see it. And that's because of the way they're raised. And I'm not making that wrong. This takes decades, this takes generations for this to disappear, and I hope it does. Because I'm passionate. I was very passionate about women's liberation when I was younger. So I was very oppositional to my father, for sure. And I'm all about the sisterhood. I'm all about empowering women. And that's why I do these workshops on people pleasing, because I want to raise it's usually women only. Some men, sometimes I open it up. But you're right. If I ask a man who's number one on his list, he'll say, I am. And if I ask a woman, she's not even on her list. Out of 10, she's not even on her list. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in working with a woman on. But if I can explain people pleasing, where it comes from, we have we have 4 trauma responses, but we're more familiar with 3: fight, flight, freeze. Okay. The 4th one is fawn, which is the sort of psychological term for people pleasing. So what happens is, when we're little children, everybody's bigger than us, right? And more powerful than us and has authority. So we can't fight. We can't move down the road and get a job and get an apartment or whatever. So we freeze. And in that frozen state is when we develop some of our personality adaptations. Now, take 2 children in the same family, because no 2 children are really born into the same family, but there's 2 children. And one goes the narcissistic route, because they've realized that I want all of this praise and admiration to come this way, and I feel really good about myself. So there's a wound. That child is wounded. The other end of the spectrum, if I can just basically do that, this child goes, I'm going to go and be nice to everybody. And then people will validate me, and I will feel really good about myself. So they're 2 complete opposites. Now, if they were not related to each other and they were just 2 people, and they met later in life, they would be the perfect trauma bond. Because one is a taker and one is a giver. So they trauma bond. And this is, again, the work that I do a lot on, because people
and that
pleasing.
Trauma is that need for...
It's the woundedness.
But self-worth and value that
See
you're
me?
getting
Hear me?
external, and that's the shift that I think, and that's the power, the shift of being able to recognize that, but also getting that validation not from the external, whether that's your
Yes.
relationships, whether that's perceived success, whether that's, you know, driving a Ferrari, all those sort of things, and that's never going to feed that sense
No.
of that
No.
self-worth and value. It has to come from within.
That's right.
in yourself. But just out of interest, if you've got that awareness, you've stopped, how does NLP feed into that? Because the thing about NLP, and having done it and had to do it, is it's practical. It's a really practical way of beginning to reprogram that negative rhetoric. So just tell everybody about NLP.
Oh wow, this is such a big question.
Because I just think it's so powerful.
It is. I mean, so much of it is mindset, anchoring, mirroring, matching, things like that we can do in conversations. To me, NLP is really about communication, but it's a physiological communication. And we now know that there's been research done years ago, and it's very, very good research on what is good communication. And this is a basis that we use in NLP too. So I think it's something like, oh gosh, am I going to remember this now? Something like 55% of good communication is physiological. So it's not just body language, how we're sitting, but it's skin tone changes, breathing changes, sometimes sweaty palms, things like that.
Yeah.
So when I'm with a client, I'm physiologically calibrating them, which is what we're taught in NLP. 38% of good communication is tonality, how you say it. Right?
Yeah.
So, could you get me a cup of coffee, please? Or
Yeah.
could you get me a cup of coffee, please?
Yeah.
Two different things. And only 7% are words.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's mind-blowing. So texting, emailing is only, 93% of the communication is missing, which is what I'm also passionate about, because the best communication is as much as you can be in the room with the person, the third dimension of being with them. So NLP is really about understanding how to communicate with ourselves and with others to be understood. But what goes on in our minds is thinking on purpose, choosing things that we're going to focus on, because where focus goes, energy flows.
Yeah.
So if you're going to focus on the Hollywood disaster film and it's going to end in catastrophe, that's what you'll get. So we literally use techniques like that.
Talk a little bit about how we can start to change, because you talk about muscle memory, how we can start to change how we think about ourselves, that inner critic, that quite practical that we can almost do after this session.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite techniques, if I may, is that, let's say you're here and you want to be more successful. You want to stand on stage perhaps, or do more Instagram stories or reels, YouTube, whatever, and you don't have that confidence. So there's a lot of visualization in NLP. So you would visualize or remember a person that you saw, maybe a person that has all the attributes that you want. And even if you can't find that person, you can create one in your mind. So I want that voice, and I want that height, and I want that posture, and things like that. So you make an image of this person, and you put it on your timeline. We do a lot of work on timelines, so I hope this makes sense. You put it out there on your timeline, and you look at this person. You hear this person, because, you know, we're all about the five senses, what we see, hear, taste, touch, smell. That's very much NLP. So you have as much of a visceral experience with that person that you possibly can have. And this is a great technique that Paul McKenna taught us. So you really get so into being that person. And I've seen it done. And some people, this one guy once, he did Arnold Schwarzenegger. And when he finally did it, when he finally did the last piece of it, which I'll explain, he became Arnie. It was like the voice. It's amazing to watch. But what you do is you really ramp this up, and you're almost in that moment with that person. And then you turn them around, and they've got a long zipper on their back. And you walk up to it, and you undo the zipper, and you step into that, to all of that visceral experience, that sensory experience that person is having. And I have watched people, I get chills just thinking about it. I've
Really?
watched people. So I was his assistant for like 10 years and thousands of people, you know, I've watched do these things. And they step into it. Their posture changes, their head goes up, their voice changes. And that is a really quick and easy way to change your state, because NLP is all about changing your state, your state of mind, your physical state. And if you can, when you join those two up, because we are mind-body connected, we mustn't divorce those two from each other, you really have this amazing experience. And then you can anchor that. You probably know about anchoring, where you can anchor it in your fingers by just doing that, or you can anchor it in that pose. So the next time you want to feel like that, you might be sitting there with somebody, you might just do this with your, you might rubbing your fingers, or in your mind you may do the same thing again, walk up and unzip it. I really like that, because it's sort of
holistic. So my story with NLP is I was doing live TV. So it wasn't pre-recorded. I was very, very anxious and very stressed. I could feel the stress. And it was live, I had earpieces, I had cameras, and I felt out of my comfort zone. I didn't have the skills, the experience, and my stress levels, anxiety, and then all my negative rhetoric around that, because I was very, very, very shy as a child. My self-worth, all that sort of stuff. So I was like, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to be on live TV. I'm not gonna be able to do it. I'm going to be terrible. And there was a lot riding on it as well. And I just thought, I need more help. And I went to an NLP practitioner, and it was very sort of similar. It wasn't the sort of who I walked into, and I liked that. But what they did is they worked out, firstly, whether I was sort of visual, auditory, or kinesthetic.
I sort of mentioned that, quickly.
And what they realised very quickly is I'm very visual. So I think in pictures, I see in pictures, I write in pictures, I learn in pictures. So they said, is there a picture, a scenario where you're doing something and you're very confident? And actually it was quite interesting, because it was flower arranging, because my mother used to do flower arranging, and I picked that skill, and it is something I'm very good at, and I love it, and I get a lot of passion. It's creative. I love it, love it, love it. So I pictured, it's funny how these things come to mind, because you don't know where your mind, or I guess your heart at one level, is going to take you. But the picture was, we had a dinner party for 16 people, and I dressed the table. I did literally 8 different flower arrangements, small, large. It was like something out of Homes and Gardens. And when I pictured it, it gave me a real sense of achievement and positive. Then they played out the worst case scenario of me going on air. I had to talk through it with them. And I said, they're like, what is the worst that can happen? And I said, the very worst thing is that I would literally live either start crying or wet myself. It was just it was so horrific. And as I was talking, that anxiety came. And they basically said, now what you need to do is, as you start to feel that and you start playing that disaster story, you superimpose it with, and I don't know what
it's called the swish pattern.
The switch pattern.
The swish pattern. You
the
swish.
So
one
you swish.
over
So
the
you
other.
swish. So you swish. And then they drill it. So you go into that scenario, and then they say, right, when I click, when you hear that sound, then you swish.
Then
you switch. Then you switch. Then you switch. And I got that pattern. And then, as you talk a lot about, it's muscle memory, right? So you have to put the effort in. You have to
think on purpose.
You have to think on purpose. So, and then what they said is, now that you've got that, the skill, we've taught you how to do it, now it's down to you. So when you feel you're in that situation, swish. That has stayed with me my whole life.
That's wonderful.
Since. And now when I'm in a scenario that I feel vulnerable or I'm exposed, I still use that now. It's really powerful.
That's great. You had a really good
powerful. But I like the idea of unzipping and stepping into, because it's almost like stepping into who you can be, who you want to be, even more so than the swishing.
Yeah, and what happens is I've literally heard people's voice change.
Really?
It's an instant. It's just like that. They step in, and of course you can tweak it. You can add more of this and add more of that.
Yeah.
And I would recommend that you don't do it with a real person, like somebody that you absolutely admire. I mean, you can start there, but then add things onto it.
Yeah.
Because it is just such a magnificent way
Yeah.
of doing it. So what you would do, in your case, you would have done that in the green room as you were waiting to go on.
100%.
So you want
Yeah.
to manage your state and create a state. You don't just walk in and go, you know.
Yeah.
NLP is all about state management.
Yeah.
Not the United States, but
Just
that
out of it,
state.
so this is quite interesting because you use this technique, this swishing technique. I'm working on the premise of muscle memory. Is there a point when you're working with your clients that they're working really hard on themselves, creating the person they want to be, can be, their bigger, stronger self? If you do it consistently enough over a period of time, to the point that it becomes a new habit, way of seeing yourself, almost subconsciously, do you leave that old self behind?
It's a great question.
Or are you always, if you're in a situation where you are exposed or vulnerable, maybe out of your comfort zone, that deep-rooted conditioning comes back?
That's such a great question. How I would answer that is, it's about building resiliency, right? That's what muscle memory is also doing. It's like a bell curve. You know, think of driving a car. You probably got in terrified, and after a while, and then you were like, okay, now you drive down the motorway 10 miles and don't even realize you've driven 10 miles because you're singing songs or whatever. So that's, hopefully you're not doing anything else, but you know, you're focusing on the road. So that's what it looks like. That's the bell curve of learning something. But in that situation, life does happen. There are activations that we will encounter as we're going through life. But what the difference is that the recovery is much shorter because you have tools. And I heard this great expression the other day. I think it was Dr. Peter Levine, and he said, without tools, trauma rules.
Oh, yeah.
And what we learned in NLP is we had like a tool belt. We had this imaginary tool belt. And we had all these things as a practitioner and as a client. Your practitioner gave you a tool, right? Yeah. And you're still using it to this day.
Yeah.
So yes, things will happen. We might slip back a bit, but then we got to remind ourselves, awareness, right? I've got a tool for this. I'm going to pull out that tool.
Yeah.
And maybe it's something he or she taught you, but you didn't use much of, and now you can use that tool, right? You can use affirmations, or you can step into somebody else. Or I use a lot, to get quick results, I use a lot of hypnosis. Because see, the thing is, well, that's very much a part of NLP.
Yeah.
Because hypnosis is also eyes opened. It's not always eyes closed. You can do hypnosis with people.
Yeah, I kind of feel the NLP is almost like a self-hypnosis.
It is.
Because that's what you're doing. Like whether you're swishing or, you know, we talk a lot about the inner critic. I mean, one of the things, and I've written an article on it, how to tell the inner critic to shut the hell up. I mean, even by recognizing that's your inner critic and going, you know what, you're not welcome here, I'm going to shut the door on you.
That's right.
That's a tool, but it's almost like a self-managed tool.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the hypnosis bit, because is it a practitioner helping you with that hypnosis, or is it having the tools or the knowledge to be able to apply it yourself?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, because I think it's very misunderstood. First of all, stage hypnosis is completely different to what therapeutic hypnosis is.
Right.
And Paul McKenna, who was a stage hypnotist and is now a hypnotherapist, he actually explained this to us. He said, they go through filters and filters. They're filtering people from the moment they walk in, from the moment they buy the ticket. They're filtering them. When they get those 2 or whatever people on stage that are, you know, quacking like ducks or talking like Martians or whatever, they've bought in. So that's completely different. I just want to make that clear.
Right.
A hypnotherapist has no control over your mind whatsoever. And I want to make that clear. So you're lying there, you're in a state of hypnosis, and the building catches on fire and you hear a fire alarm, you're out, right? Because you have that ability to know that. It's sort of in a semi-conscious state. You are totally in control of everything, right? This is certainly how I work. I'm sure, as in anything, there are people unethical, but I can't speak for that. This is one of the premises of NLP. You have everything inside of you already that you need to heal. I'm not going to give you anything. All I'm going to do is talk to those parts of you. Because let me just back up
It's
for a moment.
Help me unlock that power.
Well, everything we've talked about, muscle memory, in terms of muscle memory, is in the unconscious. I say unconscious, some people say subconscious. It doesn't matter. So they're like sentries at the gate guarding your unconscious mind. Now, if somebody wants to stop smoking, for example, logically, consciously, they know that smoking is terrible for them. But unconsciously, they've taught themselves how to be a really good smoker, right? So we need to talk to that part of them, that part of them that is the locked away, guarded by the sentries. And you don't do that with talking therapies. You can, but it's going to take years. Right. So you get somebody into a state of absolute relaxation. They have to trust you. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And they are willing and they want to make a change in themselves. And what happens is, and this is certainly my experience, clients say to me, I sometimes heard you and then I faded away. And then I came back and I faded away. Perfect. That's exactly what you want. Because your ears are permanently opened and they're connected to the brain, right? So you're hearing everything you need to hear. I would have done an archaeological dig with them beforehand to find out really what, like their VAK, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. I would feed them stuff, words that would, resonate with them. Not with me, because I'm very visual, maybe somebody's auditory. But it's really a relaxed state where you get permission. I get permission from them. Is it okay if we speak to your unconscious? And we do finger signals. That's very much an NLP thing. They might be lying there and they'll go, and that means yes. Because I don't want them talking to me. I want them to be sort of nonverbal at that point when we're doing a deep hypnosis. And we start talking to their unconscious. And there's something called a 6-step reframe, which is an NLP thing. I couldn't explain it all to you today.
We're going to have to do another session on this.
Yeah, 6-step reframe is amazing. And it changes the outcome. You start here and you end up there. And you've changed your belief system and values and things.
That's so quite interesting. Like you talked about visualizing this persona or you, right? Your biggest,
you can do that in hypnosis perfectly.
But your most powerful, your superwoman, whatever it is, self. The state that you're talking about with the sort of hypnosis, I quite like guided meditations.
It's a similar thing.
It's a similar thing, isn't it? So you can do guided meditations which take you down a journey, which is very beautiful to help you relax. But actually, the meditations that I do that I like, they're very short, because I always think I never have time, I'm too busy. So I've now have a 4-minute meditation, and you can fit 4 minutes into your life. But I do a morning meditation. Yeah, good. Which is 4 minutes, and it's guided, but it's very positive. It's all about positive mindset, setting me up for the day, and it's got some of that sort of hypnotic type elements
very much
into it.
Hypnotic, yes.
And it's really powerful. And then sometimes I do one at night, and it's interesting what you say, because sometimes if I do the ones at night, they're a bit longer, they're like 20 minutes, and sometimes I feel like I've faded, or then I sort of come back. But actually what you're saying is you are hearing it.
That's a hypnotic state.
Yeah, you're absorbing it. And I think that goes back to all of it is part of the self-talk, isn't it?
It's switching out.
It's switching it.
So the bad voice for a better voice, where focus goes, good voice, energy flows.
And that good voice is something that we have to, if we don't have it, we have to create a positive voice. Yeah. That takes us into the self-critic, and part of that for me is the awareness is key, because if you don't hear yourself or can't see yourself, then there's no pause or stop, is there? Once you're aware, it's then what tools have I got in place, and especially around that inner critic, to tell it to shut the hell up. And that's fine. You can go, inner critic, that's what you're saying, but I know it's not real, shut the hell up. But then you need to replace it with something positive.
I'll give you a really quick tip. Yeah. This is an NLP tip. You give the inner critic a funny name and a funny voice. Dr. Richard Bandler used to do Mickey Mouse or Minnie Mouse. But do whatever you want. You can call it popcorn, bananas, whatever. You want to give it something that makes you smile, because you want to change the state. Yeah. So when you hear that inner critic going, you're awful, who do you think you are? Why are you wearing that? Give it a funny voice, give it a funny name, and you'll begin to laugh at it, and its power will dissipate.
Yeah, and there's a power in
And
laughter.
then it's another swish pattern. So you're dissipating this one, you're strengthening this one, and it works so beautifully. Give it a go. Truly, it works.
Right,
Give
that's our homework, because we can't.
I call it heart work.
Heart work. I love
homework
that.
Has a bad anchor for a lot of people. It certainly does for me. So I call it heart work.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We will definitely have you back because I think we can do a whole series with you. So we've got our heart work. So let's see how we get on. And I'm going to think of a really funny name for my inner critic.
Please.
I'm going to share
Give it a funny voice. So when it talks to you, you laugh. Seriously.
Right, I'm going to do that. I'm going to give it a funny image, a funny voice, and I'm going to create that funny inner critic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.